I usually do is basically just tell the story of how I got involved with the ideas that are in this book and my first book, and then from there go on to sort of explain or to sort of describe the larger levels that it sort of took me to intellectually and theoretically, and yeah, I mean, so that's where I'll go from here. I mean, the first book I wrote was called Breaking Open the Head, which was specifically about shamanism and psychedelic substances, which have been obviously outlawed in our culture for a long time. And basically how that came about was I was working as a journalist and a writer and a magazine editor in New York, and I was in my late 20s, and I began to go through a kind of existential crisis. I'd grown up in this totally secular, materialist culture. My parents were artists and writers, but they'd sort of totally divorced themselves from their religious past and their sort of ancestors' religion and so on, and were totally committed to scientific way of thinking and sort of a nihilistic perspective that like this life was it, and there was no evidence of any other possibility of anything else. And so when I was in my late 20s, I was working in New York, and I'd written for the New York Times Magazine and Esquire and Wired, and had a little career going. I just hit this point of almost sort of a dark night of the soul, like a kind of spiritual desperation, where I was sort of like, well, what's going on here? Like, what are we all rushing around? Where is this ambition going? Where is this society going? And what does it all mean anyway if there's no any aspect to being? It was almost like a classic Woody Allen film, Crisis, where Woody Allen will go through this thing where suddenly he goes out and tries all these different religions and he doesn't know what to do, So I decided to go, I sort of began to think about my life up to that point, and I tried to figure out if there had been any point where I'd had any other kind of opening to other forms of consciousness that seemed significant and potentially suggestive of other possibilities. And I remembered psychedelic experiences that I'd had in college at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. So, I had this journalistic skill set, so I decided to be systematic and started reading a lot about psychedelics, and then did some, took some, also had some assignments where I was able to really do it more intentionally. I wrote for the Village Voice a piece about ayahuasca. How many people in this room have heard of ayahuasca, just out of curiosity? So it's that's actually impressive, and it's been interesting. I mean, since when the first book came out, I felt like almost nobody had heard of ayahuasca. That was 2002, and I can definitely see that it's kind of making its inroads into the mainstream culture and consciousness right now. There was recently a Supreme Court decision. Well, first of all, ayahuasca is a psychedelic drink brewed together from two plants that's used in the Amazon by tribal groups. We don't really know how far back they used it, and it's all the way from Brazil through Colombia, Ecuador, Peru. And they also refer to it as a medicine, so it has a lot of medicinal properties. Often makes people purge, get rid of parasites and stuff that's in their system. And then it has a whole kind of spiritual and shamanic and visionary dimensions to it. So just recently, the U.S. Supreme Court, rather startlingly, sort of approved legitimated use of ayahuasca use in these two religions that had come out of Brazil. Actually, essentially this one religion, União de Vegetalis, had fought this battle up through the court system. So like the peyote for the Native American church, ayahuasca now has legal protection on the federal level for use in these certain religious traditions. And that happened because they'd also done a lot of research on these churches in Brazil and the members of these churches, and it turns out they were good citizens, good workers, didn't beat their wives, that actually they were kind of their kind of level of activity was above the normal level. So Brazil ended up giving the churches a sort of clean bill of health and accepting them. And there are also branches in Europe, and it's actually kind of spreading throughout the world now. But anyway, so that was something that I really explored in those particular traditions, those churches, I explored in the second book. So for Breaking Open the Head, I did a story for The Voice, drank ayahuasca with this shaman who's coming through town from California. And I just kept learning about this stuff, and I ended up getting an assignment to go to West Africa and take a psychedelic that's used in initiation rituals there called iboga down in Gabon. And this substance And I read a lot about it before going down there. I went down with a botanist, and I knew that it was very long-lasting. And certain reports and certain people said that they said it was the equivalent of something like 10 years of psychoanalysis in one night. And of course, that sounded totally ridiculous and implausible. When I actually had this experience of taking iboga in the ceremony, it was very, very psychoanalytic. And there was a kind of visionary aspects to it. And the thing lasted like 20 hours or something. They're drumming and making you dance and do all this stuff during the ritual. But there's this whole long visionary dimensions of it. And I had sort of visions in the beginning. And then I had a long kind of stretch where it was really like delving back through my memories, my early childhood memories, kind of chronologically. And it really did feel as if there was a kind of guiding intelligence, some kind of intelligence or spiritual entity that was connected with this plant and this ritual that was sort of taking me on a tour of my life up to that point. And showing me, like I saw like my sort of parents' divorce and early this injury, sort of illness I'd had as a child, and also my use of alcohol as an adult and how that was kind of negatively affecting my writing and my relationships and so on. And after this experience with iboga, I definitely sort of permanently cut down on drinking to a certain extent. Which is interesting because iboga is in the West known as ibogaine, and it's actually being utilized as a drug treatment therapy, especially for addictions, heroin and cocaine addiction. And there are clinics in Mexico and in Canada which are using it for this purpose with quite a lot of documented success. And there were also things that came up in and around the ceremony and in the next days with these different shamans where there was things that they told me which sort of eventually came true, or they seemed to have access to knowledge about me that was very surprising. And it definitely just shook up my worldview on many levels. One of them, another shaman during this other ritual, had taken some iboga, and he said that he saw my mother's mother above me, around me, and that she died recently, and she was stopping me from going into the other world and having certain experiences and certain visions. And it was true that my mother's mother had died recently, and that was the only grandparent I'd had. So, I hadn't told him anything, or any of these people, anything about myself or my grandmother. But it just somehow it seemed able to actually somehow see this other reality around me. So breaking open the head, I then became more and more interested in these substances and indigenous cultures, and really the book ended up sort of charting a shift in my worldview from going from this sort of secular materialist worldview to accepting that there was a kind of psychic or shamanic reality, and that there were aspects of these indigenous knowledge systems that the West had suppressed and negated. And it was almost as if, and that really, that was what the book became a sort of inquiry into, So, and clearly we have what happened in the 1960s, where the psychedelics erupted into the mainstream culture and seemed to be involved with catalyzing a large-scale shift in consciousness, and then all use of them was suddenly curtailed by the government, but then also by, it's almost like too much energy was unleashed, and people really didn't know how to deal with that. So I sort of make an inquiry into the 60s and into psychedelics, magic, shamanism, and but it was really very step by step. And I think if you read the book, I try to, as John was pointing out, I sort of remain within skepticism in that I'm trying to understand the context for these experiences. But then I was having these experiences that seemed to violate the kind of rational Cartesian model of reality that I'd grown up in. And I had some experiences that were very occult. I tried this synthetic psychedelic, and I had sort of poltergeist phenomena and a sense of this entity following me through my dreams. And I didn't even believe in the occult or in poltergeist. And finally, I had a friend who had training as a witch who came and did an exorcism. And this was to me, that seemed totally ludicrous, and yet, frighteningly, palpably true and real at the same time. So by the end of working on breaking open the head, I was sort of left with this big question. It was it seemed to me that the modern West had become obsessed with this kind of sort of left-brained rationality, material, empirical way of being and knowing, and we had negated a whole aspect of reality that was intuitive, psychic, shamanic, and when I looked around at our world, it seemed like we were entering these sort of critical juncture on many levels, and it seemed actually that could be kind of dangerous, that we had no contact with this other kind of reality that these traditional people knew about. And so then the question that was left to me is like, well, what do these indigenous cultures think about what's happening now? What, if they have access to a different form of knowledge that we've rejected, and that knowledge has legitimacy, then just rationally and thoughtfully, I have to take that seriously, because it's like we've only gotten like half the picture here. So that led me to this new book, which is called 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl. And so basically, when I began to think about that stuff, I learned that a lot of indigenous cultures around the planet have specific prophecies related to the time that we're in now. For instance, the Hopi Indians, who were the original dwellers in this continent, believe that we're in this transition between what they call the fourth world and the fifth world. And they say that they have a whole set of oral prophecies about stuff that was supposed to happen, has happened, and there's really only a couple of little things left to go before we go through this transition. And most, I also got interested in Jungian concepts a lot, and really looking at even the Western Judeo-Christian tradition in terms of the idea of the apocalypse, and how that might have legitimacy as another kind of archetype that's somehow coming to presence in the contemporary psyche at this point in time. But then most specifically, I got interested in the classical Mayan culture. Once again, I mean, our way of kind of framing knowledge and what's going on is that all cultures of the past were basically, they were interested in myth, they were interested in magic, but they really weren't serious. They didn't really have like knowledge and in the way we did. They just didn't really have it together. That we actually developed this empirical scientific knowledge system, and we have the most advanced knowledge system ever. Okay, so that's our kind of model, our kind of thought construct for thinking about reality. But what might be possible is that there might be other cultures in the past that had other knowledge systems that were in some respects more advanced than our knowledge system. But they were interested in different aspects of reality, different sort of pieces of reality. So what I ended up studying when I got into this Mayan material, I mean, basically the mainstream archaeologists who are once again in that kind of empirical, rational mindset, they look at the Mayan culture and basically say, they were interested in these rituals, and they were fascinated by calendars and astronomy, and they did have this whole thing about the year 2012 being like the end of a huge cycle, but it's just like an odometer clicking over, or it's just the way we would paint George Washington with angels crossing the Delaware. They would sculpt their kind of fantasies about what this could mean. But then there are these sort of more like outsider visionary scholars. And I would say probably some of them, like me, were inspired by their experiences with non-ordinary states of consciousness and psychedelics, meditation, to have an insight to take the Mayans' culture more seriously. And what they kind of present is that the Mayan culture was this kind of incredible flowering of Mesoamerican civilization. In the same way Tibetan Buddhism kind of arose to be this incredibly complex civilization based on spiritual disciplines and practices that may have complete empirical technical legitimacy, that if you follow these practices you will attain these states of consciousness. So that the classical Mayan culture may have similarly reached this point where they had developed a very different knowledge system than ours. And at the basis of what they seem to be interested in, and also the Toltec civilization that preceded them, was in understanding a kind of process of evolution, in a sense, development, that seems to be linked to astronomical cycles particularly. And